There seems to be a lot of chaos in Kiev, where President Zelensky just fired his top commander. There's certainly chaos in Washington, where they can't figure out how to get the next $60 billion to Ukraine, even though they want to. What do you make of where we are in this war?
Well, on the battlefield, Russia is taking apart Ukraine, and the death toll for the Ukrainians is terrifying. But Washington remains steadfast on one point, which is no negotiations, no discussion of real solutions, a war-only approach. It's pathetic, absolutely pathetic. And the idea of putting another $61 billion into more deaths for Ukraine, more destruction for Ukraine, without a word about politics and a solution to this is Biden's complete failure. So I find the situation shocking. I find it shocking that a large part of the Senate and almost all of the Democratic Party mindlessly goes along with this. We have heard since those 2 months even more stories about how the U.S. stopped the negotiated settlement in 2022. This is mind-boggling in the complete absence of any interest whatsoever in ending this war.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you've been a critic from the start of the U.S. role in Ukraine. I have as well. There's no consolation to have been vindicated given how disastrous the war has been. But certainly everything you're describing now is visible to everybody in Washington, even if somehow it wasn't at the start of the war, that Ukraine cannot win. There's no way to expel all Russian troops from Ukrainian soil, let alone from Crimea. There's just no possibility of any of those objectives being fulfilled. What, at this point, do you think is the objective, or and looking back, what has been the objective all along?
Well, I think the objective all along for the last 30 years was to put the U.S. and NATO into Ukraine. And at each point, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, this has been going on for more than a decade. And before that, it was Nuland as part of the Bush administration. They thought they could bluff their way in or frighten Putin and their way in and so forth. It's just been one stupid, cruelly ignorant miscalculation after another. They got to the point where every gambit failed. The only thing that they accomplished was spending more than $100 billion of U.S. money and about 500,000 casualties in Ukraine, a catastrophe. And now they have an election coming. So to my mind, at least one part of this story is just get to November without an embarrassment. No matter how many more deaths they cause, another $61 billion doesn't matter. It's not their money. They're just trying to avoid embarrassment for what has been an absolutely disgraceful foreign policy for a decade. We're in the 10th anniversary of Biden, Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan participating in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. And this is what it's brought: complete disaster for Ukraine and nothing good for the United States.
Guess if there's one silver lining, it's the fact that this request for $60 billion has been pending before the Congress for several months now. They struggled for a long time, and as of this week, they're trying everything, and so far nothing's working. Not just to send $60 billion to Ukraine, but also another $17 billion to Israel. Is this just something that you think is kind of an election year theater in Congress where they're kind of trading for things and eventually we'll send it? Or do you think it actually reflects some change in the politics in terms of what Americans think about sending huge amounts of money to finance other countries' wars when our country is in many ways falling apart?
Well, I think it is exactly the fact the Americans are completely against this. Spend another $61 billion with the massive budget deficits, with the cuts in essential services. I point out in a post today that the $61 billion exceeds our nutrition programs for women and children, Environmental Protection Agency, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Labor, added all together. But, it's games for these senators. I think what's interesting is, in fact, it's routine for the senators to routinely vote mindlessly money for the military-industrial complex. And the fact that they're with these hiccups right now and they want to do it, but they can't do it, is because it's so atrocious what they're being asked to do. Something that it is a disaster in Ukraine and that is complicity in genocide in the case of the war in Gaza. And so it's completely unjustified, this money. And yet they're still trying because their normal mode is to vote money for the military. And for this to be even a hiccup right now is something different. It's because the American people are absolutely against it, and because the real purposes of this are so awful that there's no justification. And interestingly, while there's debate, there's no substantive discussion. You don't hear Chuck Schumer, who pushes this every day.
We've just shared one of Glee Greenwald's latest clips and hope you found it interesting. Now, we'd love to share our thoughts on the topic and invite you to join the conversation in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Let's keep the discussion lively. The situation in Ukraine remains dire, and it's a stark reminder of the catastrophic foreign policy blunder under President Joe Biden's administration. Jeffrey Sachs, an esteemed economist, has voiced stark criticism which highlights the profound failures in handling crises such as Ukraine and Israel, revealing an absence of nuanced strategy and an alarming predilection for escalation over diplomacy. The Biden administration, seemingly determined to pour billions into the Ukraine conflict, appears more interested in a show of force rather than seeking an astute resolution. This is not just imprudent, it's reckless. The continuation of this conflict without a clear pathway to peace paints a grim picture of a Washington that is steadfast in pursuing a militaristic approach that sidelines diplomacy and constructive dialogue. While Russia besieges Ukraine, the death toll continues to climb and the country endures relentless destruction. The U.S. is locked in this grim stance of unyielding support that only seems to fuel the conflict further. And it is not just the administration, but a disturbingly large segment of the political establishment, including Democrats, who march in lockstep with this policy, bereft of foresight and moral clarity. The revelation of the U.S. obstructing potential negotiated settlements intensifies the specter of a prolonged war. It raises questions about the true objectives of U.S. involvement. Over the last 30 years, there has been a concerted push to extend Western influence to Ukraine's doorstep, prompting aggressive reactions from Russia. The strategic miscalculation here has been colossal. The assumption that America could bluff or intimidate its way to achieving its geopolitical aims in the region has proven dangerously flawed. Now, we must scrutinize what Biden and his foreign policy team hope to accomplish. It seems that their objective has less to do with Ukrainian sovereignty and more about affirming U.S. and NATO power, essentially playing geopolitical chess with lives hanging in the balance. Their inability to engage Russia diplomatically, to carve out a path to peace that recognizes the complex historical and political tapestry of Eastern Europe, is appalling. The Biden administration must pivot away from this path of destruction. We need diplomacy, not endless military aid that leads to unending conflict and human suffering. Trump's approach to foreign policy emphasized America's strength, but paired it with strategic dialogue, fostering a landscape where negotiations could take place, and war wasn't the default mode of operation. In stark contrast, Biden's approach seems to validate fears of those who forewarned of his shortcomings on the international stage. In sum, the handling of the Ukrainian crisis exemplifies a foreign policy disaster that necessitates immediate reevaluation. America ought to champion peace and stability, not become an enabler of never-ending warfare. It is high time for President Biden to recognize the gravity of this misguided venture, to course correct, and to seek an end to this devastating conflict, not only for the sake of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, but for international security and America's moral standing in the world.